Dear students, welcome to this series of lectures on public administration. Today, my topic for deliberation is development and modernization theory. The objectives for this lecture are to know the relationship between development and modernization, to understand the concept and evolution of modernization, to know the Rostov's theory of modernization and stages of economic growth, to critically examine the modernization theory of development. So students, let's start with the introduction. Development is a process. This process has been taking place in societies since time immemorial, but it has acquired greater intensity and velocity during the past 500 years and has accelerated rapidly over the past 5 decades. In the broadest terms applicable to all societies and historical periods, development can be defined as an upward directional movement of society from lesser to greater levels of energy, efficiency, quality, productivity. Development today is not merely an economic phenomenon. It encompasses more than the financial side of people's lives. Development should be perceived as a multi-dimensional process involving the reorganization and reorientation of the entire economic and social system. In addition to the improvements in institutional, social, and administrative structures, as well as in popular attitudes and, in many cases, even customs and beliefs. One of the approaches to critically understand the process of development and different stages of development is presented by the theory of modernization. Since the end of World War II, modernization has been among the most powerful paradigms invoked to develop societies in the Third World and elsewhere with enormous social, cultural, and economic consequences. This lecture narrates the historic origins and characteristics of modernization theory as a continuation to our earlier discussion of dimensions of development. Modernization is based on neoclassical and neoliberal political theories and grounded in the grand project of enlightenment, namely reasoning, rationality, objectivity, and other philosophical principles of Western science. Modernization approaches, including neoclassical and neoliberal economic theories, extol scientific rationality and individualism. Economic growth via the Western model of adopting a capitalist economic system, building up formal infrastructure, and acquiring technologies is prioritized. Implicit in the discourse of modernization is a theory of what constitutes societal development and a methodology of how it should be brought about. Now students, let's have a look on modernization approach to development. Modernization approaches have been one of the most influential theoretical perspectives on development since their emergence in the 1950s. Primarily, attention has been focused on the ways in which past and present pre-modern societies become modern, that is, westernized, through process of economic growth and social, cultural, and political change. Although there is no single theory of modernization, but rather an assortment of related theories and perspectives. Collectively, this body of work refers to description and explanation of the processes of transformation from traditional or underdeveloped societies to modern societies and envisages a process of change towards those types of social, economic, and political systems that have developed in Western Europe and North America. Many scholars in academia and development practitioners have defined the concept of modernization in varied ways. Benedict's in 1967 argues that due to industrialization and the French Revolution in France, there were significant changes in social, economic, political, educational, and other fields in the society at that time. If other countries follow the changes in Western countries, it will be called modernization. For Ascendant in 1969, modernization is a process of change towards the kind of social, economic, and political systems that existed in Western Europe and North America from the 17th to the 19th century. Gary considered modernization to be a complex concept. In this regard, he argues that there is a substantial difference in the societies we call modern. In fact, modernization refers to the changes in traditional societies. In his major work, The Passing of the Traditional Societies, published in 1958, Daniel Lerner examined the process of modernization in several Middle East countries, carried out a sample survey in other underdeveloped societies, and supplemented all this with his observation of village society. Lerner's premise is that modernization is a global process occurring in a similar manner the world over, and the role of indices of development like mass media, urbanization, increase in literacy, etc., are responsible for the emergence of a new economic order. Thus, from the contribution of all these scholars, the process of modernization sums up the change that combine to convert an agricultural or underdeveloped society with a weak state into an industrialized society with a relatively efficient, active government. The modernization process embraces change that leads up to this industrialization and urbanization. The modernization paradigm presumes a set of interrelated processes: capitalism, industrialization, surveillance of society, and control of the means of violence. Giddens in 1990 provides a condensed description of these institutional dimensions of modernity. He talks about capital accumulation, which is insulated from the political dimension, but set within the context of competitive labor and product markets. Next, he talks about the surveillance set in the backdrop of the nation state, which aids in the control of information and social supervision and is closely intertwined with capitalism. Then he talks about the surveillance functions of the state is coupled with military or police power to maintain full control and monopoly over means of violence. This is usually exercised through the internal hegemony of civil authority structures, which execute courts of criminal law and supervise individual deviance from the normal with the help of the military and other lethal forces lurking in the background. And then he talks about the importantly industrialism, which constitutes the main axis of interaction between humans and nature. Unlike pre-modern societies, industrialism, with the aid of modern science and technology, transforms nature into built environments subject to control and coordination by humans. The enterprise of modernization influenced a dominant paradigm of development, which has guided intellectual thinking and practice from the 1940s to the globalized present. Everett Roger noticed that, and I quote, "This concept of development grew out of certain historical events, such as the Industrial Revolution in Europe and the US, the colonial experience in Latin America, Africa, and Asia." He distilled four overlapping assumptions in this view of development. Economic growth through industrialization and accompanying urbanization was considered the key to development. It was approximately equal to passing through the Industrial Revolution. It was also assumed that development performance could be measured quantitatively in economic terms. Western science would produce technological development solutions that were capital intensive and labor extensive. Planning would be centralized and controlled by economists and bankers in order to guide and speed up the process of development. Underdevelopment was mainly due to problems within developing nations rather than in their external relationships with other countries. Clearly, economic growth and Western scientific values constituted key themes in development as a solution to underdevelopment under modernization. As Rogers in 1976 noted, economists were ultimately in charge of development plans, particularly in the earlier development decades. 5-year plans were launched in many countries to dovetail development activities and help bring about orderly economic progress. Bilateral and multilateral aid organizations were involved in these plans. Problems were identified and solutions offered at the higher level of government. Information and other inputs were then channeled down to local communities. Participatory or autonomous development by local communities was considered slow, inefficient, and more often than not unlikely. In the dominant paradigm, industrialization was considered the main route to successful economic growth. At least, that was the means by which North America and Western Europe had developed in the late 19th century. So, third world countries were encouraged to invest in a program of industrialization such as hydroelectric projects, steel industries, and various heavy manufacturing units. Development performance was and continues to be largely measured by quantitative indicators such as GNP and per capita income. These indicators are considered objective and straightforward to measure, especially when compared with alternative concepts such as freedom, justice, and human rights. As a corollary to prioritizing economic growth and technological solutions, quantitative empirical science, a product of the Enlightenment in Europe, was uncritically accepted as the dominant scientific methodology. Now, students, let's have a look on the modernization and stages of economic growth. The dominant paradigm of development that has ruled the social sciences prescribes a particular economic path to modernization, that is, the neoclassical and neoliberal approaches. Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations, which was published in 1776, originally proposed the neoclassical approach, which was later supported and enriched by other Western economists such as Ricardo, Schumpeter, Keynes, Hirschman, Marx, and others. The dominant paradigm encouraged macroeconomic planning and promoted a high degree of corporate and state intervention in the economy. It was in continuation of this philosophical thinking that a unilayer model of development was proposed. Among the proponents of the unilinear economic model of development, Walt Rostow deserves a special mention. Rostow expounded his economic growth theory in the Stages of Economic Growth, a non-communist manifesto which was published in 1960, in which he constructed a 5-stage model of transition. These stages are: the first stage, the traditional society. The essential feature of this society is that output is limited because of the inaccessibility of science and technology. Values are generally fatalistic and political power is non-centralized. Large number of people are employed in agriculture, which has very low productivity because of the factors we already discussed. In such a society, family and clan groupings are emphasized in the social organization. The second stage is the preconditions for takeoff. This second stage of growth is one of transition. A traditional society does not move directly into the process of industrialization. First, certain preliminaries need to take place. There are clusters of new ideas favoring economic progress arising, and therefore new levels of education, entrepreneurship, and institutions capable of mobilizing capital like banks, etc. Investment increases, especially in transport, communication, and raw materials, with a general direction towards commercial expansion. But in accordance with Rostow, traditional social structures and production techniques remain the same. There is the presence of a dual society. Third stage is takeoff. In this stage, finally, the old traditional order and resistances are overcome. New forces which trigger economic growth expand and dominate the society. Agriculture is commercialized. There is a growth in productivity because that is necessary if the demand emanating from expanding urban centers is to be met. New political groups representing new economic groups push the industrial economy to new heights in Britain, Canada, and the United States. The proximate stimulus for takeoff was mainly, though not entirely, technological. The takeoff period began in Britain after 1783, in France and in United States around 1840. In Russia is about 1890, and in countries like India and China around 1950. Now, the fourth stage is the drive to maturity. In this stage, the growing economy drives to extend modern technology in all its economic activities. Between 10 and 20% of gross domestic product is invested, and the economy takes its place in the international order. Technology becomes more complex, refined, and there is a move away from heavy industry. Now, production is not the outcome of social necessity, but of the need of maximizing profits to survive in a competitive capitalist market. And the fifth stage, the final stage, is mass consumption. In this final stage, the leading economic sectors specialize in durable consumer goods and services. At this stage, economic growth makes sure that basic needs are satisfied and more resources are allocated for social welfare and social security. The emergence of the welfare state is an example. Durable consumer goods and services are diffused on a mass basis. Rostow thought of his theory as a dynamic one, that is, that deals not only with economic factors but also with social decisions and policies of government. Rostow's model stated explicitly that once key institutions and certain behavior patterns were established, development was more or less sustained. The changes were irreversible, and the process of development moved in a common universal direction. In sum, these concepts and processes that had worked successfully in the US, Canada, and countries of Western Europe were therefore prescribed for the development of third world nations. The concepts, processes, and models did not always transfer readily to developing nations. Additionally, they were frequently insensitive to the needs of certain demographic and minority groups, and they resulted in much environmental degradation. Nonetheless, the modernization model remains dominant today, adapting to rapid political, economic, and technological changes. This is abundantly evident in development policies and projects emphasizing private sector development, entrepreneurship, and technological advancement. Now, students, let's have a look on the critique of modernization. Beyond models of economics and of social evolution, modernization is a discourse. Scholars offer an important critique of the modernity discourse, which has attempted to describe the process of modernization as the universalizing of Enlightenment principle. Gray describes universalism as, and I quote, the metaphysical faith that local Western values are authoritative for all cultures and peoples, unquote. He goes on to argue that many elements of Westernization, for example, the capitalist free market, were specific to the Western historical context and should not be seen as the inevitable destiny for all other economies. The teleological bias in such theories is what may have led Fukuyama in 1992 to declare the end of history. It is the ethnocentrism embedded in such discourse that has led to a discursive manipulation bias, which is represented and sustained by the bipolar theories of modernization. Developing country societies are viewed as preconditions and the West presented as the end stage of development. This dualism thus becomes the single, universal story of human development, thereby placing the West in the van of history, modernity seen as the culture property of the West, and tradition as the defining cultural deficit of the rest. The previously described model put forth by Rostov and Lerner echo this ethnocentric, universalizing, and teleological bias of modernization discourse. The discourse has created an imaginary geography of the Orient as the binary opposite of core European cultural values and practices. An examination of modernization discourse historically reveals the goal of replacing non-Western ideological, cultural, and even language systems with Western systems. In the decades that followed World War II, attempts were made to gradually replace or alter knowledge systems and existential realities of the people in the Third World by the concepts of progress and development imported from the West. Scholars consider US President Harry Truman's 1949 inaugural address as the symbolic watershed separating the earlier era of fascism and colonialism from the neo-colonialism of the post-World War II period. While the earlier eras were painted discursively with a negative brush, the post-World War II era was associated with the mantra of development and a fair deal for the underdeveloped areas of the world. The modern and developed First World, the socialist Second World, and the underdeveloped Third World were conceived in part in this discourse. The diverse societies in the South with different cultures, geographies, and histories were lumped into the overarching concept of the Third World. What held this group together was the imagined concept of underdevelopment. Thus, putting a twist on Edward Said's definition of the Orient, this development discourse enabled the West to manage the Third World, not just economically, politically, and socially, but also discursively and imaginatively. The new developmentalism facilitated institutional interventions in Third World countries, giving rise to greater mechanisms of control. In exchange for developing these countries and their economies, the everyday realities of people were transected and translated into objects for scientific pursuit. The modernization theory of development also came along with gender bias. Western views of gender roles in relation to the public-private sphere distinction also have greatly influenced development discourses. Modernization exported a Western capitalist model in which the male breadwinner headed the family unit while the women raised children and managed the household. Western conceptions of Third World women as victims of religion and culture. Previously noted meant that the combination of gender and religion further marginalized women in the development process. So students, let's conclude this lecture. As already discussed, it is well understood that both modernization and development processes are complex and multidimensional. Both encompass a series of cognitive, behavioral, and institutional reforms and restructuring. Modernization and development are both worldwide processes. From the modernization theory, one can understand that the spread of ideas and technology takes place from one original central place to other places in the world. It's clear from historical observation that the goal of modernization and development are under the specified level and sub-level. As modernization and development progresses to advanced stages, the constriction between national societies begins to constrict, and finally comes situation and stage in which the universal compulsion of modern ideas and institutions by society ultimately leads to the state of a worldwide society. The modernization theory of development articulated knowledge and power through the ideological construction of social problems. Soon, individuals in so-called underdeveloped countries started imagining their underdevelopment. The physical and social realities were produced and reproduced in the dialectic of development and underdevelopment through every possible mechanism: economic, political, social, discursive, and spatial. Modernization aimed to replace nearly everything indigenous with imports from the West, both material and non-material. This meant a dismantling of traditional culture, including religion, which often was regarded as the greatest impediment to progress. It also included indigenous gender roles to be replaced by Western norms, and it included indigenous views on environment and land use also to be replaced by Western values. So dear students, I hope all of you got comprehensive picture of all the aspects, issues and indices related to development. See you soon with another lecture. Till then, take care. Thank you.